Σε μια πολυτελή έπαυλη στην Κηφισιά, ένα μωρό αρχίζει να μαραζώνει μυστηριωδώς μετά την άφιξη της νέας συζύγου του εφοπλιστή. Η μόνη που καταλαβαίνει ότι κάτι δεν πάει καλά είναι μια απλή γυναίκα, οπλισμένη μόνο με τη διαίσθησή της και το θάρρος της. Όμως, αυτό που ανακαλύπτει ερευνώντας το γάλα του μωρού είναι τόσο ανατριχιαστικό που μπορεί να τη στοιχίσει την ίδια της τη ζωή. If this story's got you hooked, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Mansion. The Sterling family mansion was always the kind of place that made people stop on the sidewalk to stare. Located in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in New York City, on the Upper East Side, the property took up an entire city block, with high walls covered in perfectly trimmed ivy and a wrought iron gate that looked more like a work of art than a simple entrance. It was impossible to walk by without feeling that mix of awe and distance that the homes of the ultra-rich always inspire in ordinary people. Teresa knew every corner of that house, every slab of Italian marble on the floor, every imported crystal chandelier, every priceless painting hanging on the walls. She had arrived there more than 30 years ago, when Mr. Edward was still a young businessman full of dreams and ambition, newly married to Anna, a sweet and simple woman from a traditional New York family. Teresa had been hired as a housekeeper, but over time she had become practically part of the family, caring for the house with the same devotion she gave her own children. Mr. Edward built an empire. Luxury hotels scattered across the country, idyllic resorts in the Florida Keys, charming inns in the Berkshires. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. But on that September morning, as Teresa climbed the marble staircase to the third floor, she couldn't stop thinking about how money couldn't protect anyone from pain. It had only been 6 months since Anna was gone. 6 months since that terrible day at the hospital, when what should have been a moment of joy turned into a final goodbye. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start, full of complications that worried the doctors. But Anna insisted everything was fine, that she would soon be holding her baby in her arms and it would all make sense. The labor was long and complicated. When little Michael was finally born, crying lustily in the nurse's arms, it seemed the worst was over. But in the hours that followed, Anna's body simply didn't recover as it should have. The complications piled up, one after another, until the doctors could do no more. Teresa still remembered the scream Mr. Edward let out when he got the news, a sound that seemed to come from such a deep place in his soul that it echoed through the entire hospital. She was there, holding the sleeping baby Michael, oblivious to the tragedy that would mark his life from his very first day. The boy would never know his mother. He would never know Anna's sweet smile, how she used to hum softly while arranging flowers in the garden, or how her eyes sparkled when she talked about the son she was expecting. The first few months were devastating. Edward barely left his room. The house, once full of life and activity, became a silent mausoleum. The baby cried, and Teresa and the other staff members took turns caring for him, but the father could hardly bring himself to look at his son. It was as if Michael was a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Teresa understood his pain, but her heart broke to see that child growing up without his father's love, without the warmth of a hug, without someone to look at. Him with that special light that only parents have. It was during this period of deep mourning that Christina appeared. Teresa remembered the day she first saw her perfectly. It was a March afternoon, the sun streaming through the living room windows, creating those golden shafts of light that seemed to hang in the air. She was arranging flowers when she heard the click of high heels on the marble floor of the entryway. She turned, and there she was, tall, elegant, in a dress that probably cost more than Teresa earned in 6 months. Perfectly styled brown hair fell. Over her shoulders her makeup was flawless, and a practiced smile played on her red-painted lips. Christina Morgan came from the world of fashion. She had been a model in her youth and now worked as an image consultant for executives and celebrities. She met Edward at a charity event organized by mutual friends. He was vulnerable, lost, desperately searching for a way to fill the void Anna's death had left. And Christina, with all her smooth talk and calculated charm, knew exactly how to present herself as the salvation he needed. The romance was fast. Too fast, Teresa thought, as she watched from a distance. In less than 3 months, Christina was practically living in the mansion. In 6 months, the wedding was announced, a discreet ceremony, for close friends and family only, in the estate's private chapel. Teresa watched from afar, a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. It wasn't envy. It wasn't anger. It was a strange feeling, as if something was wrong, as if a shadow had fallen over the house. At first, Christina seemed to be good for Mr. Edward. He started going out again, smiling, dressing with more care. The house regained some of its former energy, with dinner parties for important clients and social events. But Teresa noticed something that bothered her deeply. Christina avoided little Michael as if he were invisible. The baby had just turned 8 months old. He was in that adorable phase where he could sit up on his own, babble sounds that seemed to want to be words, and reach his little arms out to anyone who came near. But when Christina passed by him, it was as if she didn't even see him. If the baby cried, she would close her bedroom door and turn up the volume on the television. If Teresa brought Michael into the living room, Christina would make an excuse and leave. On the rare occasions she had to interact with the child, she did so with a mechanical coldness, holding him as if he were a fragile, unpleasant object that needed to be returned as soon as possible. Edward didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. He was so absorbed in trying to rebuild his life, in searching for some meaning after the tragedy, that he didn't see what was happening right under his nose. Teresa tried to mention it once, subtly, but he just smiled wearily and said that Christina was still adjusting, that not every woman was born with a maternal instinct, that they needed to give it time. But time only made things worse. It was Christina who suggested hiring a full-time private nurse for Michael. She argued that the baby needed professional care, someone with the proper training who knew how to handle all the needs of such a young child. Edward, always trusting his new wife's decisions, agreed without question. And that's how Valerie came into the house. Valerie Scott was in her early 40s, short and stocky, with a serious expression that rarely broke into a smile. She presented an impeccable resume, a nursing degree, a specialization in pediatric care, references from prominent families. Christina had been the one to recommend her, saying she knew her through a friend who also worked in the fashion industry. From the first moment, Teresa felt something was off about the woman. It was hard to explain exactly what bothered her. Valerie was polite, efficient, always dressed in her pristine white uniform, but there was something in her eyes, in the way she looked at the baby, that sent a chill down Teresa's spine. And what was worse was the way she and Christina talked, always in low voices, always stopping when someone approached, exchanging glances that seemed to carry secrets. The first few weeks with Valerie seemed normal. Michael followed his routine, was fed on schedule, slept well, and played with his colorful toys. But then, subtly, things began to change. Teresa was the first to notice. She had raised 4 children of her own, and had helped care for more than a dozen nieces and nephews. She knew babies. She knew when something wasn't right. And with Michael, something was definitely not right. The boy started to become quieter. He used to be cheerful, noisy, always babbling and seeking attention. Now he spent hours in silence, with a distant look in his eyes, as if he were in another world. When Valerie fed him, he would cry and struggle, turning his face away, refusing the bottle with an insistence that wasn't normal. The nurse would force him, sometimes roughly, saying the child was spoiled and needed to learn to eat properly. But what alarmed Teresa the most was realizing that Michael was losing weight, slowly but visibly. His chubby cheeks started to thin out, his little arms grew skinnier, and the clothes that used to be snug were now loose. She mentioned it to Valerie, who responded irritably that it was normal for babies to have weight fluctuations, that she was the professional here and knew what she was doing. One night, Teresa couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room in the staff annex, staring at the ceiling, thinking. Something was wrong, very wrong, and she had to find out what it was. The next morning, she decided to watch more closely. She stayed nearby during feeding time, pretending to be busy with household chores. She saw Valerie prepare the bottle in the kitchen, measuring the formula powder with a scoop that seemed too small, filling the bottle with too much water. She saw the nurse shake the bottle hastily, not caring if it was mixed well. And she saw Michael, when he was fed, cry so hard he was out of breath, turning his little face away, refusing the liquid that seemed to have no taste. That same afternoon, Edward came home early from the office. He was starting to do that, more often, trying to be more present in his son's life. He picked Michael up, sat in the living room armchair, and asked Teresa to prepare a bottle. She made it exactly as she always did, following the instructions on the formula can, measuring correctly, warming it to the perfect temperature. And then something happened that made Teresa's heart nearly stop. Michael drank the whole thing, without fussing, without crying, without turning his head away. He lay peacefully in his father's arms, sucking on the bottle with gusto, his little eyes starting to sparkle again with the liveliness that had disappeared. Edward smiled, a genuine smile Teresa hadn't seen in months, and said softly, "See, my son, Daddy's here. Everything's going to be okay." But Teresa knew it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. That night, after everyone was asleep, she went down to the kitchen. She had to be sure. She needed to confirm her suspicions before making any accusations. With trembling hands, she prepared 2 bottles, one exactly as Valerie did, with the measurements she had observed during the day. The other the correct way, following the instructions on the package. The difference was stark. Valerie's bottle was a lighter color, more watery. The smell was faint, almost non-existent. Teresa dipped her finger in and tasted it. It tasted like water with a slight hint of milk. The other, prepared correctly, had substance, a strong milky smell, a nutritious taste. Anyone could see the difference. How had no one noticed before? Or maybe someone had noticed and simply didn't care. Teresa's heart raced. She saved a little of the diluted formula in a small, clean vial, hiding it at the bottom of her purse. She needed proof. She needed something concrete before she confronted anyone. But one thing she knew for sure, this wasn't negligence. It was intentional. It was being done deliberately and calculatedly. But why? Why would anyone do this to a helpless baby? What kind of monster was this? The next morning, Teresa woke up determined. She had a son, Robert, who worked as a lab technician at a private hospital downtown. He was a serious, studious young man who had managed to get his degree by taking night classes while working during the day. She had always been proud of him, of how he had made a life for himself despite the difficulties. She took the bus to the hospital, the vial hidden in her purse. She met Robert during his lunch break at a nearby diner. He was surprised by his mother's unexpected visit, but grew even more concerned as she told him everything. Christina and Valerie's strange behavior, the baby's weight loss, the difference in the bottles. "Mom, this is really serious. If you're right, we're talking about something criminal," Robert said, looking at the vial as if it were a bomb about to go off. "I know, son. That's why I need proof. I need to know exactly what that woman is putting in that child's food." Robert agreed to run some discrete tests at the lab. He said it would take a few days, but he could get detailed results. Teresa returned to the mansion with a heavy heart but a flicker of hope. Soon she would know the truth, and when she did, she would do whatever it took to protect that baby. The next few days were torture. Teresa watched everything with heightened attention, mentally noting every detail, every whispered conversation between Christina and Valerie, every time the nurse prepared Michael's food. She began to see a pattern. Whenever Edward was home, Valerie would ask Teresa or another staff member to prepare the bottle. But when he left for work, she would make it herself, always with those wrong measurements, always in a hurry, always with that cold expression on her face. And Christina was always nearby, supervising, as if she wanted to make sure everything was being done exactly as planned. One afternoon, Teresa passed by Michael's room and heard voices. She stopped outside the slightly ajar door, her heart pounding. It was Christina and Valerie talking in low voices, but not that low. "He's asking why the boy is so skinny," Valerie said with a worried tone. "Tell him it's a growth spurt, that it's normal. Didn't the doctors already confirm there's nothing wrong in his checkups?" Christina replied impatiently. "Yes, but that old housekeeper is watching everything. She makes me nervous." "Teresa, don't worry about her. She's just the help. Who's going to believe her word against ours?" Christina let out a small laugh, a sound that held no joy. "Just a few more weeks, Valerie. Just a little longer and everything will be resolved. The baby will get weak enough, any little thing will seem natural, and then—" The sentence hung in the air, but Teresa didn't need to hear the rest to understand. Her legs almost gave out. She had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. It was worse than she had imagined. Much worse. It wasn't just neglect. It was a plan. A cold, calculated plan to harm that baby. For what? To inherit Edward's fortune. To get rid of the only tie he still had to Anna. Teresa backed away from the door silently, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She needed the lab results. She needed concrete proof. But most of all, she needed to act fast because now she knew that time was running out for little Michael. That night, lying in bed, Teresa prayed like she hadn't prayed in years. She prayed for strength, for courage, for protection. She prayed that her son would get the results in time. She prayed that Edward would believe her when she told him everything. And she prayed especially for Michael, that innocent baby who had been born into tragedy and now had his life threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The Sterling mansion, which had always been a symbol of power and success, now held a dark secret within its marble walls and under its crystal chandeliers. And Teresa, a simple housekeeper who had dedicated 30 years of her life to that family, found herself at the center of a battle that was just beginning. She didn't know it yet, but in the coming days, her life would change completely. She would discover the depths of human evil when money and power are at stake. But she would also discover that courage doesn't have to come from grand gestures, and that sometimes the most unlikely people are the ones who make the difference between life and tragedy. As the night deepened over New York City, with its infinite lights and constant hum, everything inside the Upper East Side mansion was silent, but it was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, the kind of silence that holds dangerous secrets, and Teresa, lying in her simple room, knew that the storm was about to break. Chapter 2. The Truth Revealed. The next 3 days were the longest of Teresa's life. Every minute seemed to crawl, by like an eternity, as she waited for Robert's call with the lab results. She went about her normal routine in the mansion, cleaning, organizing, preparing meals, but her eyes and ears were always on alert, observing every move Christina and Valerie made. Michael continued to waste away. Each day he grew more listless, quieter, more distant. Teresa had to make a superhuman effort, not to just grab the baby and run out of the house. But she knew she had to be smart, strategic. If she acted on impulse without concrete proof, it would just be her word against that. Of two women who had all the power and influence on their side. It was on a Thursday morning, while Teresa was folding laundry, that her cell phone finally rang. Robert's name flashed on the screen. With trembling hands, she answered and stepped out into the garden away from prying ears. "Mom, I need to talk to you in person. I can't say this over the phone." Robert's voice was tense, filled with an urgency that made Teresa's stomach churn. "Is it bad, son?" "It's very bad, Mom, very bad. I'm leaving the hospital now. Can you meet me at the park near the mansion in half an hour?" Teresa agreed and hung up. She told the kitchen staff she needed to step out quickly to buy a few things, grabbed her purse, and practically ran to the small park 3 blocks from the Sterling mansion. It was a small tree-lined square frequented by nannies with strollers and elderly people feeding pigeons. She sat on a bench under a flowering dogwood tree and waited, her heart pounding erratically. Robert arrived 15 minutes later, still wearing his white lab coat and carrying a folder of documents. He sat down next to his mother and, before saying a word, took her hands in his. Teresa saw in her son's eyes the confirmation of all her worst fears. "Mum, what you gave me isn't baby formula. I mean, it has traces of formula, but it's diluted to less than 40% of the normal concentration," Robert began. Opening the folder and showing her papers filled with numbers and technical terms Teresa didn't fully understand. "A baby getting this isn't receiving adequate nutrition. He'll start losing weight, get weak, and develop severe nutritional deficiencies." Teresa felt a wave of nausea. Even though she had expected this confirmation, hearing it out loud was devastating. But there's more, Mom. A lot more, Robert continued, his voice growing even graver. We found traces of sedatives in the sample, not a lethal amount, but enough to make a child drowsy, listless, with no energy to cry or react. "Oh my God," Teresa whispered, bringing her hands to her face. "They're poisoning that boy. They're killing him slowly." Technically, it's not poison in the traditional sense, but the effect is the same. A malnourished and sedated baby has no defenses. Any simple infection could become severe. Any minor health issue could escalate into something serious. And when something happens, it will look natural. It will look like the child had some undiagnosed condition, Robert explained, the contained anger showing in his voice. "This is premeditated, Mum. This is a deliberate plan." Teresa was silent for a moment, processing it all. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together in a terrifying way. Christina and Valerie were intentionally harming Michael, slowly and calculatedly, so that when something serious happened, no one would suspect a thing. Edward would be left with another tragedy, even more vulnerable, and Christina would have total control over him and his fortune. "What do I do now, son? How do I save that baby?" Teresa asked, tears starting to stream down her face. "You go to Mr. Sterling and you tell him everything. Show him these documents. Demand that he take Michael to an independent doctor, one with no connection to Christina or Valerie. And if he doesn't believe you, you go to the police. This is attempted murder, Mum. It doesn't matter who these women are or how much power they have." Teresa nodded, putting the documents in her purse. Robert hugged her tightly before heading back to the hospital, making her promise to be careful. She stayed in the park for a few more minutes, gathering the courage for what she was about to do. She knew that by confronting Edward, she would be putting her own safety at risk. But when she thought of that innocent baby, of those little eyes that were losing their sparkle every day, she knew she had no choice. She walked back to the mansion with firm steps, a new determination burning in her chest. Edward was in his study, working on his computer. Teresa entered without waiting for permission, and closed the door behind her. He looked up, surprised by the housekeeper's unusual boldness. "Mr. Sterling, I need to talk to you about something very serious. About Michael," Teresa said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Edward frowned, closing his laptop and giving her his full attention. Teresa had never entered his study like this, had never interrupted his work. He knew it had to be important. "About Michael, what happened? Is he okay?" he asked, a pang of concern crossing his face. "No, sir, he's not okay, and he's not okay because someone has hurting him, on purpose." The words hung in the air for a moment. Edward looked at her as if he hadn't understood, as if Teresa had spoken in another language. "What are you talking about, Teresa? What kind of accusation is that?" Teresa then told him everything, every detail she had observed over the past weeks, every whispered conversation she had overheard, every strange behavior. She told him about the diluted bottles, about how Michael cried when Valerie fed him, but ate normally when Edward did. She told him about the conversations she had overheard between Christina and Valerie, and finally she took the lab reports out of her purse and placed them on the desk. Edward picked up the papers with hands that were beginning to tremble. He read them once, then again, then one more time. Teresa saw the color drain from his face, saw his hands clench the edges of the paper so tightly they almost tore. "This can't be true," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Christina wouldn't do this. She wouldn't. Mr. Sterling, I've worked in this house for over 30 years. I took care of you when you were young. I took care of Mrs. Anna, and now I'm trying to take care of your son. I would not have the courage to come in here and say these things if I wasn't absolutely certain. Your son is in danger." Edward shot up from his chair, knocking it over. He began to pace the study, running his hands through his hair, his breathing growing heavy. Teresa saw the exact moment he decided to believe her. It was as if a mask fell from his face, revealing the horror of understanding beneath. "Where are they now?" he asked, his voice low but charged, with a contained fury Teresa had never seen in him. "Christina went out for lunch. Valerie is in the nursery with Michael." Edward stormed out of the study like a hurricane. Teresa followed, her heart racing. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, where the baby's room was. Edward shoved the door open with force, making Valerie jump in surprise. She was sitting in an armchair, scrolling on her phone, while Michael slept in his crib, pale and far too still for an 8-month-old. "Get out. Get out of my house now," Edward said, his voice as cold as ice. Valerie stood up, confused, looking from Edward to Teresa and back to Edward. "Mr. Sterling, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" "You know damn well what you did. And when my lawyer is done preparing the paperwork, you'll answer for it in court. Now get out before I have security drag you out." Valerie turned pale. For a second, her professional mask slipped, and Teresa saw the panic of someone who'd been caught in her eyes. She quickly grabbed her purse and left the room, practically running down the stairs. Edward went to the crib and picked Michael up. The baby opened his eyes, still too drowsy from the sedatives, and Teresa saw a tear roll down the father's face. He hugged his son to his chest, whispering apologies over and over. "I didn't see it. How did I not see it? How did I let this happen to you?" he repeated, his voice breaking with emotion. Teresa approached, gently touching his shoulder. "You were grieving, sir. You were vulnerable. They took advantage of that," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "But now you know, and now you can protect your son." Edward nodded, wiping his tears. He picked up his phone and called his private physician, demanding he come to the mansion immediately to examine Michael. Then he called his lawyer, telling her to begin all possible legal proceedings against Valerie. And finally, his voice tense, he called Christina. Teresa only heard Edward's side of the conversation, but it was enough. He demanded she return home immediately. He accepted no excuses or delays, and he hung up without waiting for a reply. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind. The doctor arrived and examined Michael thoroughly, confirming malnutrition and finding low levels of several essential vitamins. He recommended immediate hospitalization for stabilization, but Edward refused, saying he wouldn't let his son out of his sight for a second. The doctor then drew up a strict nutritional recovery plan to be followed at home under constant supervision. Christina arrived just before 3 in the afternoon. She walked through the front door with her usual confident stride, but Teresa noticed a hint of nervousness in her eyes when she saw Edward waiting for her in the living room, holding Michael, with an expression on his face that would tolerate no lies. "What was so urgent, darling?" Christina asked, trying to keep her tone casual, but her voice came out a little too high-pitched. Edward didn't answer right away. He just looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing for the first time who she really was. Then, with careful movements, he handed Michael to Teresa and walked toward Christina, stopping just inches from her. "How long did you plan this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "When did you decide my son was an obstacle that needed to be removed?" Teresa saw the color drain from Christina's face. For a split second she considered, denying it, feigning outrage. But something in Edward's eyes made her realize the game was over. "I don't know what you're talking about," she tried anyway, but her voice had no strength. Edward then threw the lab reports onto the coffee table. "Yes, you do. You and your accomplice were poisoning my son. Slowly, calculatedly, so that when he got seriously ill, no one would suspect a thing. Did you really think I would never find out?" Christina looked at the papers, then at Teresa holding the baby, then back at Edward. Teresa saw the exact moment she decided to switch tactics, moving from denial to attack. "Fine, you want the truth? That baby ruined everything. He killed Anna, and then he was just here, a dead weight, sucking up all your attention, all your time. You were so obsessed with your grief you couldn't move on. I was just trying to free you from that." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward stared at Christina as if she were a stranger, someone he had never seen before. And maybe that was exactly it. "Get out of my house," he said finally, each word as sharp as broken glass. "Pack your things and get out. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce and the criminal charges. You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. I have rights," Christina retorted, but now her voice held a note of desperation. "You tried to harm a helpless baby. You have no rights here. And if it's up to me, you'll be spending a long time answering for this in court." Christina looked around, as if searching for someone or something to save her. Her eyes landed on Teresa, and in them was a burning rage that made the older woman take an instinctive step back, clutching Michael tighter. "This was you, wasn't it?" Christina hissed, advancing toward Teresa. "You shouldn't have gotten involved, you—" "Enough!" Edward shouted, stepping between Christina and Teresa. "You've done enough damage. You will not go near them. Now get out before I call the police." Christina backed down, but the look she shot Teresa was one of pure hatred. She went upstairs to the bedroom she shared with Edward, and Teresa heard the sound of drawers being yanked open, of objects being thrown into suitcases. Half an hour later, Christina came down carrying 2 large bags, walked through the living room without looking at anyone, and stormed out the front door, slamming it hard enough to make the pictures on the walls rattle. When the sound of her car faded into the distance, Edward collapsed onto the sofa, looking as if he had aged 10 years in a few hours. Teresa came and sat beside him, still holding Michael, who was finally starting to seem more alert, his little eyes taking in his surroundings with more focus. "I was an idiot, Teresa. A complete idiot," Edward said, his voice thick with guilt. "How did I not see who she really was? How did I let my son be put in danger? You were grieving, you were vulnerable. She took advantage of that," Teresa repeated gently. "But it's over now. Michael is safe, and he's going to be okay." Edward nodded, but Teresa knew this was far from over. She had made powerful enemies, women who would not accept defeat easily, and the worry in her eyes showed that she knew exactly what was coming. That night, after Michael was put to bed in his crib, with Edward insisting on staying by his side, Teresa returned to her small room in the annex. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but she also felt a sense of relief. She had done the right thing. She had saved that baby. She was about to get into bed when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Her heart pounding, she opened it. "You're going to regret sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You're going to pay for this." Teresa's hands trembled as she held the phone. She had no doubt who had sent the message, and she knew it wasn't an empty threat. Christina had resources, connections, power, and now she had a reason for revenge. Teresa turned off the light and lay down, but she knew she wouldn't sleep that night. The shadows in the Sterling mansion had been brought into the light, but now other, perhaps even more dangerous, shadows were beginning to form. The battle for Michael's life had been won, but the war was just beginning. Chapter 3. Under threat. The days following Christina's expulsion were an emotional roller coaster for everyone in the Sterling mansion. Michael began to show signs of improvement almost immediately, with proper nutrition and, without the sedatives, the baby became more active, more vocal, more present. The sparkle returned to his eyes, his little cheeks started to fill out again, and he went back to reaching his arms out to be held, babbling happily in a way that filled the house with life. Edward was a changed man. It was as if discovering the truth about Christina had woken him from a trance. He took a leave of absence from work to stay home and personally care for Michael. He hired a pediatric nutritionist who came every day to monitor the baby's recovery, and, for the first time since Anna's death, Teresa saw him truly smile when he looked at his son. But it wasn't all rosy. The threat Teresa had received on her phone was just the first of many. In the days that followed, the messages became more frequent and more specific. They came from different, always blocked numbers, often in the middle of the night when Teresa was trying to sleep. "You think you're safe in there? We know where you live. We know where your kids work. We know everything about you." A meddling housekeeper who doesn't know her place. You're going to learn to stay out of things that aren't your business. Enjoy it while you can. Everything you love can disappear in the blink of an eye. Teresa tried to ignore them, to delete the messages without fully reading them, but it was impossible not to feel the fear growing like a cold shadow in her chest. She told Edward, who immediately involved his security team and filed a police report. But they both knew that anonymous text messages were hard to trace and that the police had more pressing cases. It was Robert who first realized the threats weren't just virtual. One night, leaving the hospital after his shift, he noticed a black sedan parked across the street from his apartment. It wouldn't have been a big deal, except that the same car had been there for 3 nights in a row, always with someone inside, always watching. When Robert tried to approach and confront them, the car sped off. "Mom, I think I'm being followed," he told Teresa over the phone, trying to keep his voice calm but failing to hide his concern. "This car shows up every day, and today at the hospital a woman I've never seen before came up to me in the parking garage and said I should be more careful about the tests I run. That sometimes poking around where you shouldn't can cause problems." Teresa's blood ran cold. They weren't just making threats. They were showing they could reach her family, that they knew where they were and what they did. It was a calculated psychological intimidation designed to make her back down, to make her question whether getting involved had been worth it. But Teresa wasn't one to back down. She told Edward everything that same night, and he, seeing the gravity of the situation, made a decision that would change everything. "Teresa, I can't let you and your family be in danger for doing the right thing. Not after everything you've done for us," Edward said, sitting in his study with Teresa across from him. "I want to offer full protection for you and your children, and I want you and your family to come live here at the mansion." Teresa was speechless. Live in the mansion. She, who had always been an employee, who had always kept her personal life separate from her work, was now being invited to bring her entire family into this world of luxury and danger? "Mr. Sterling, I can't accept that. What you're already doing is too much. And my children, they have their own lives, their jobs." "That's exactly why I'm offering. They have their lives, and I want to ensure those lives are safe," Edward interrupted, getting up and walking to the window overlooking the gardens. "Christina has connections, Teresa. She knows powerful people, dangerous people. If she decides to get revenge, it won't just be with text messages. Here with my security team, with cameras everywhere, with guards at the gate, you'll be protected. And for the rest of our lives, we'll live in fear, always looking over our shoulders," Teresa asked, her voice weary. "No, because in the meantime, my lawyer is gathering all the evidence needed to make sure Christina and Valerie are held criminally responsible for what they did. The lab results, the security camera footage showing Valerie preparing the bottles, it's all being compiled. When the criminal proceedings begin, they'll be too busy defending their own freedom to think about revenge." Teresa wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that the justice system would work, that people with money and power were also held accountable for their crimes. But she had lived long enough to know that things didn't always work out that way. Still, thinking of Robert, of her other children, who could also be in danger, she knew that accepting Edward's protection was the wisest decision. "All right, but only until this is all resolved. I don't want to be a burden to you, sir," she said finally. Edward smiled, and there was genuine gratitude in that smile. "Teresa, you saved my son. You saved my life. You will never be a burden, never." In the following days, the mansion underwent a transformation. Edward had the rear wing renovated, creating comfortable apartments for Teresa and her 3 children. Robert was the first to move in, bringing only the essentials from his rented apartment downtown. Teresa's other 2 children, Michelle, a teacher, and Kevin, a rideshare driver, also accepted the invitation after a few strange incidents at their own homes. A car following them, a stranger asking neighbors about them. The presence of Teresa's family brought a new energy to the mansion. Michelle, who always had a way with children, started spending time with Michael, telling him stories and singing nursery rhymes. Kevin helped with small repairs around the house and loved talking to the security guards about protection techniques. And Robert, always serious and studious, became a sort of informal consultant to Edward on Michael's health. But the tranquility was only on the surface. The security cameras picked up strange movements around the property. Cars driving by too slowly, people stopping across the street, pretending to be on their phones, but clearly watching the mansion. One night the guards caught a man trying to climb the back wall. He got away before they could. Detain him, but the message was clear. They hadn't given up. It was on a rainy October afternoon that the situation escalated terrifyingly. Teresa was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard screams from the garden. She ran to the window and saw Michelle stumbling toward the house, pale as a ghost, with a frightened, crying Michael in her arms. "Mom, there was someone out there. Someone called my name," Michelle cried, bursting through the kitchen door with trembling hands. I was playing with Michael near the rose bushes when I heard a woman's voice call my name. When I looked up, there was a woman on the other side of the wall looking at me with this weird smile. She said, "Such a beautiful baby. It would be a shame if something happened to him, wouldn't it, Michelle?" Teresa's blood ran cold. She grabbed Michelle and Michael, pulling them inside and locking all the doors. She hit the panic button Edward had installed, and within seconds, the security team was sweeping the entire perimeter of the property. They found no one, but everyone knew the threat had been real. Edward rushed home from his office where he'd been, in an online meeting. Seeing Michelle still shaking and Michael crying in Teresa's arms, his expression hardened into a controlled fury. "It's over. This ends now," he said, grabbing his phone and dialing a number. When the other end picked up, his voice was like steel. "Detective Miller, Edward Sterling, I need to speak with you about an urgent situation. My son and my family are being threatened, and I have all the proof of who's behind it. I need you to take immediate action." The call lasted nearly an hour. Edward provided every detail, every document, every security camera recording. The detective, a long-time acquaintance of the Sterling family, promised to expedite the process and send a team to investigate the threats. That night, no one slept well. Teresa stayed in the room with Michelle and Michael, who only managed to fall asleep after being rocked and comforted for a long time. Robert and Kevin took turns making rounds of the house with the security guards, and Edward spent the night in his study on the phone, calling in every favor he had, demanding that the law be enforced. It was the next morning that things finally started to move. Edward's lawyer, Patricia Drummond, a woman in her 60s with an impeccable reputation, arrived at the mansion with news. She had obtained a court order to investigate Christina and Valerie's bank accounts, and what they found was damning. There were suspicious transfers in the months leading up to the attempt to harm Michael. Payments from Christina to Valerie that far exceeded a nurse's salary. Emails exchanged between the two discussing the plan in detail, which they thought they had deleted but which forensic experts had recovered. And the most incriminating evidence of all, text messages between Christina and an unidentified third number, hiring people to follow and intimidate Teresa's family. "With this, we have more than enough evidence to request their arrest pending trial," Patricia explained, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the documents. "Attempted murder, conspiracy, witness intimidation, racketeering. The charges are serious and the evidence is solid. But what about in the meantime? While the case is ongoing, is my family still in danger?" Edward asked, the worry clear in his voice. "That's why I also requested an emergency restraining order. Christina and Valerie will be prohibited from coming near any of you. Any violation of that order will result in immediate arrest. And with the evidence we have, the judge has already signed the arrest warrants. The police should be executing them at any moment." As if on cue, Edward's phone rang. It was Detective Miller. Teresa and everyone else watched as Edward listened, his face going through a range of emotions: surprise, relief, and finally, a grim satisfaction. "Christina was arrested an hour ago trying to board a flight to Miami," he announced after hanging up. "Valerie was also taken into custody at a hotel where she was hiding. They are both in custody and will answer for all the charges." The relief that washed over the room was almost palpable. Michelle started to cry, this time from relief. Robert hugged his mother. Kevin let out a long sigh he seemed to have been holding for days. And Teresa, who had carried the weight of it all on her shoulders, finally felt her legs give way and had to sit down. But Patricia held up a hand, her face still serious. "This is a victory, but it's not the end. Christina has the resources to post bail and she'll probably try. We need to remain vigilant, and you, especially Teresa and her family, will have to give depositions, testify, go through the trial. It won't be easy." "I know," Teresa said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "But I'm ready. I'd do it all over again to protect Michael. 1,000 times." Edward walked over to Teresa and, surprising everyone, hugged her. It wasn't the hug of an employer to an employee, but of someone genuinely grateful, someone who recognized her sacrifice and courage. "You saved my son, Teresa. You saved me too, and I promise I will do everything in my power to protect you and your family. I swear it." That afternoon, For the first time in weeks, the Sterling mansion had a moment of true peace. Michael played on the living room rug, surrounded by Michelle, who made funny faces that sent him into fits of giggles. Robert and Kevin played cards at the kitchen table, relaxed for the first time since they had moved in. And Teresa, sitting in a chair by the window, watched it all with a tired but satisfied smile. The battle wasn't completely over. There was still the trial ahead, the testimonies, the hearings. Christina would likely try every possible appeal, use all her money and influence to escape the consequences. But the most important thing had already been achieved. Michael was safe, and Teresa had proven that courage has nothing to do with power or money, but with doing the right thing even when the cost is high. As the sun set over New York City, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Teresa thought of Anna, the sweet woman who had lost her life bringing Michael into the world. She thought of how proud she would be to see her son growing up, strong and healthy, protected not just by his father, but by an entire family that had come together in his name. The mansion, which had been the stage for so much sadness and betrayal, now housed hope once again. And Teresa, the simple housekeeper who never imagined she would find herself at the center of such turmoil, discovered that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are those who simply refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Night fell completely, and the lights of the mansion came on one by one like small earthbound stars. Within those walls, an unlikely family gathered for dinner, and for the first time in a long time, there was sincere laughter echoing through the marble hallways. The road ahead was still long, but the worst was over, and together they would face whatever came next. Chapter 4. New Beginnings. 6 months had passed since the day Christina and Valerie were arrested. 6 months of hearings, depositions, expert testimony, and a trial that had captured the attention of the media and New York society. The case of the socialite who tried to harm her stepson to inherit her husband's fortune made headlines in every newspaper, became a topic of debate on talk shows, and sparked heated discussions on social media. Teresa never imagined being at the center of so much attention. Reporters tried to interview her. Cameras followed her when she left the mansion to go to the market. At first it was frightening, invasive, but Patricia Drummond advised her to give just one controlled, carefully planned interview, where Teresa told her story with simplicity and dignity. The public response was immense. Overnight, she became a symbol of courage, the humble housekeeper who defied the powerful to save an innocent child. But to Teresa, none of that mattered as much as seeing Michael grow up healthy and happy. The baby was now 1 year and 3 months old, just starting to take his first wobbly steps, holding onto furniture and giggling every time he managed 2 or 3 steps without falling. His cheeks were pink and chubby, his eyes shone with intelligence and curiosity, and he had become a cheerful child who spread smiles wherever he went. Edward was a transformed father. He had gone from being a distant workaholic tycoon to a present, attentive, doting parent. Every morning before heading to the office, he spent at least 2 hours playing with Michael. He changed diapers, fed him, and sang off-key nursery rhymes that made the boy laugh. On weekends, the mansion was filled with life. Games in the garden, picnics on the lawn, and long moments of father and son simply enjoying each other's company. The relationship between Edward and Teresa had also changed. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She had become an essential part of the family, a sort of honorary grandmother to Michael, a confidant to Edward, a pillar of strength in difficult times. Edward insisted on substantially increasing her salary and ensuring that she and her children had everything they needed. But more important than the money was the respect, the genuine gratitude, the acknowledgement that she had made the difference between life and tragedy. The trial of Christina and Valerie was set for a Tuesday in April. The courtroom was packed with journalists, onlookers, and even a few high society figures who knew the Sterling family. Teresa sat next to Edward, her 3 children behind them, all dressed in their best clothes, all nervous but determined. Christina entered the room escorted by guards, wearing a discreet grey suit, a far cry from the designer clothes she used to wear. Her face was thinner, paler, and there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked at Edward with a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret, but she quickly averted her gaze when he showed no emotion. Valerie followed, also escorted, looking smaller and more frightened than Teresa remembered. The nurse, who had always been so confident and cold, was now visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she was led to the defendant's table. The trial lasted 3 full days. All the evidence was presented. The lab reports showing the diluted and adulterated formula, the security camera footage, the recovered text message logs, the testimony of the doctors who examined Michael and confirmed the severe malnutrition and traces of sedatives. Robert testified as the technician responsible for the initial analysis, explaining in technical terms how the formula had been deliberately manipulated. But it was Teresa's testimony that defined the trial. She took the stand with dignity, answering every question clearly and honestly. When the defense attorney tried to imply that she had fabricated everything out of jealousy or a desire for attention, Teresa looked him straight in the eye and said in a firm voice, "I gained nothing from this but threats and fear for my family's safety. But I would do it all again, because that child's life is worth more than anything. And no threat, no power, no amount of money will make me stay silent in the face of evil." A profound silence followed. Even the judge seemed moved by her words. The defense attorney did not pursue that line of questioning any further. Edward also testified, speaking of his period of deep grief, of how Christina had taken advantage of his vulnerability, of the neglect toward Michael that he, blinded by his own pain, had failed to see. His voice broke as he described the moment he saw the lab results, when he understood that his own son was being poisoned under his roof, with his implicit permission for not having paid attention. Tears streamed down his face as he said, "I almost lost my son because I trusted the wrong people. But Teresa, a woman I saw only as an employee, proved to have more courage and integrity than I have ever shown." The verdict came on the 3rd day. The jury took only 2 hours to deliberate. When they returned, the foreman stood with a grave expression and read, "We find the defendants, Christina Morgan and Valerie Scott, guilty on all counts: attempted murder of a minor, conspiracy, witness intimidation, fraud, and breach of trust." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Christina closed her eyes for a long moment, as if trying to block out reality. Valerie began to cry softly. The judge banged his gavel for silence and proceeded with the sentencing: 8 years in prison for each of them, with no possibility of parole. As the two were led out of the courtroom, Christina looked back one last time. Her eyes met Edward's, and this time there was only defeat in her gaze. She had lost everything: her husband, the fortune she coveted, her freedom, her reputation. And she knew it was because of her own greed and cruelty. Outside on the courthouse steps, where dozens of journalists were waiting, Edward gave a brief statement. With Teresa by his side and Patricia Drummond just behind, he thanked the justice system, the investigators, and especially the woman who had the courage to speak up when it would have been so much easier to stay silent. Teresa declined to speak, just waving to the cameras with a shy smile. But her actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. Life at the Sterling mansion gradually returned to a new kind of normal. The house, once so formal and hierarchical, had become more welcoming, more like a real home. Michelle had accepted a job as Michael's private tutor, teaching him through games and creative activities. Robert still worked at the hospital, but now lived comfortably at the mansion, contributing to expenses and helping where he could. Kevin had started a small private car service for executives, using contacts Edward had provided, and his business was thriving. And Teresa, well, Teresa was still Teresa. She still woke up early, still supervised the house, still prepared meals with the same care as always. The difference was that now she did it not as an employee, but as part of the family. Edward insisted she no longer needed to work, that he had secured her retirement and she deserved to rest. But Teresa would always smile and say she wouldn't know what to do with herself if she stopped. That house was her purpose, and Michael was the reason it had all been worthwhile. A year after the trial, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, the mansion was celebrating. It was Michael's 2nd birthday, and Edward had organized a party that filled the gardens with colorful decorations, toys, a small inflatable pool, and lots of children running and playing everywhere. There were relatives Edward hadn't seen in years, true friends who had stood by him through the turmoil, and neighbors who had become closer. But the most special moment of the day came when Edward asked for everyone's attention. With Michael in his arms, the little boy wearing a golden paper birthday crown, Edward gave an emotional speech. 2 years ago, when my son was born, I was lost in a darkness so deep I thought I'd never see the light again. I lost the woman I loved, and in my grief I almost lost my son too. But one extraordinary person, refused to stay silent. She refused to let something terrible happen under this roof, he began, his voice cracking slightly. He looked at Teresa, who was standing next to Michelle, discreetly wiping away a tear. Teresa, you didn't just save Michael's life. You saved mine too. You showed me what true courage, true integrity looks like. And today, on this special day, I want to make something official that has been a reality for a long time. He motioned to Patricia Drummond, who approached with an envelope. These are documents that make you, officially, Michael's legal guardian should anything happen to me. He will be in your care, under your protection, because I know there is no one in the world who would love and care for him better than you. The silence that followed was broken by the emotional applause of everyone present. Teresa brought her hands to her face, the tears now falling freely. Her children hugged her, laughing and crying at the same time. Edward approached and handed her the documents. I don't deserve this, Mr. Edward. I just did what any decent person would do, Teresa said, her voice choked with emotion. No, Teresa, you did what courageous people do, and for that, Michael and I will be eternally grateful. Michael, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, started clapping his hands and shouting excitedly, making everyone laugh. The party continued, with music, food, games, and immense joy. As she watched from a corner of the garden, Teresa thought about how unpredictable life was. She had arrived at this house more than 30 years ago as a simple housekeeper, and now she was considered an essential part of the family, the legal guardian of the sterling heir. But more than titles or documents, what mattered to Teresa was the smile on Michael's face, the way he ran to her with open arms, shouting Nana T, as he had started to call her. It was Edward's hug when he came home from work, the respect in her own children's eyes as they saw her as an example of strength and dignity. It was knowing she had made a difference, that her courage had saved one life and transformed many others. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the party wound down. The children left, tired but happy. The adults said their goodbyes with warm hugs, and slowly the mansion returned to its usual quiet. But it was a good, peaceful quiet, the silence of a place where there were no more dark secrets hidden, only love and gratitude. Edward put Michael to bed, softly singing a lullaby that Anna used to sing. The boy fell asleep quickly, exhausted from all the play and excitement. Edward stood there for a long moment, just watching his son sleep, marveling at every detail of that perfect little face. When he came back downstairs, he found Teresa tidying up the last remnants of the party. He approached and gently took the tray from her hands. That's enough work for today. Come on, let's sit for a bit. They sat on the living room sofa, a comfortable silence between them. Through the window they could see the city lights twinkling in the distance, the constant motion of New York that never stopped. You know, Teresa, I spent a long time thinking success was measured by hotels built, by money in the bank, by influence and power, Edward said, breaking the silence. But I found out I was completely wrong. Real success is having someone like you by our side. It's watching my son grow up healthy. It's being able to look in the mirror and know that in the end I made the right choices. Teresa smiled that wise smile, of someone who has lived a lot and learned even more. Life has a way of teaching us what really matters, Mr. Edward. Sometimes in a painful way, it's true, but the lesson is always worth learning. Always with your wisdom, Teresa, always showing me the right path. She chuckled softly. I don't have any wisdom. I just have the experience of someone who suffered enough to learn that in the end, what remains is the love you give and receive. The rest is just details. Edward nodded thoughtfully, They sat there for a few more minutes in companionable silence, two survivors of a storm that could have destroyed everything, but in the end only revealed what they were made of. When Teresa finally stood up to go to her room, Edward called out to her one last time. "Teresa, thank you for everything, for never giving up, even when it was easier to stay silent, for saving my son, for saving me." She turned, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Edward. That little boy upstairs is the reason for everything, and I'd do it all again 1,000 times if I had to." And with that, she went up the stairs to her room, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. He stayed there for a while longer, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past 2 years. The loss, the betrayal, the pain, but also the discoveries, the lessons, the love that had bloomed from the ashes of tragedy. Upstairs in Michael's room, Teresa slipped in quietly to check on the boy one last time before bed. He was sleeping soundly, clutching the teddy bear Michelle had given him. Teresa adjusted his blanket, placed a light kiss on his forehead, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, God, for giving me courage when I needed it, for protecting this boy, for showing me that age doesn't matter, that social status doesn't matter, that what matters is having your heart in the right place and the courage to act when it's necessary." She left his room and went to her own, where she finally lay down in the comfortable bed she now called hers. Before turning off the light, she looked out the window at the stars shining over New York, rarely visible through the light pollution, but especially bright that night. And she thought of Anna, the sweet woman who never got the chance to see her son grow, but who, Teresa was certain, was somehow there, protecting and blessing that boy from wherever she was. She also thought of all the Teresas in the world, the simple women who work hard, who raise their children with dignity, who even without power or money have the courage to make a difference when it counts. The story of the Sterling mansion could have ended in tragedy, another sad tale of greed and cruelty. But it didn't. It ended with love, with justice, with a family that rebuilt itself from the ruins and became stronger than ever. It ended with Michael sleeping peacefully, protected by a father who learned the true importance of being present, and by a woman who proved that the most unlikely heroes are often the truest. And so, as the night covered New York with its blanket of stars and lights, the mansion on the Upper East Side rested in peace. There were no more hidden shadows, no more dangerous secrets. Just a family, bound not by blood but by love and gratitude, sleeping soundly, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but that together, always together, they could overcome anything. Because in the end, as Teresa always said, true love and the courage to do what's right are the only things that really matter in this life, and they had both in abundance.